Uh, Thank you for joining us as we dive into the book written by Dr. Alan Dieterich-Ward entitled A Cradle of Conservation. Alan, thank you for joining us for another conversation about your amazing book.
I, my pleasure, Marcy. And as I understand it, we're here to our theme of the month is public lands, huh?
Absolutely. And part of the reason we chose this theme is we just came off of Dr. Joseph Trimble Rothrock Memorial Conservation Week, which was in August. We are on we just finished I Love My State Parks Week. So there are these weeks dedicated to celebrating state parks and state forests, but that's not the only public lands that we have in the
True.
Commonwealth. And
So true.
it's my opinion, and I'm a little biased, that, we can celebrate these every single day because they're
That's
such
right.
important attributes to our
Mhm.
quality of life here in the Commonwealth. So before we begin, I just want to remind our viewers that they can post questions in the comment box, depending on the platform that you're viewing this on. And I'll keep an eye on the comment box and relay those questions to Alan throughout the conversation. So, Alan, public lands through the lens of conservation.
Hmm. I'm
Let's
super
let's
excited to
go
talk about
into
it.
that.
Yeah, and while you're pulling up my slideshow, I wanted you to take a look. Did you see that I'm drinking my coffee out of this special cup? And can you see what that cup says, Marcy?
Oh, that is the Think Outside with the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation podcast
Yep,
logo that you picked up at the banquet.
I sure
And I want to
did. And
acknowledge that, go ahead.
I was just
I
going to
want to
say that
acknowledge that Dr. Go ahead.
you go
You go.
ahead.
I just wanted to acknowledge and congratulate Alan that he was
Oh.
recognized at the banquet. He is one of our award winners because the Cradle of Conservation book that he's done, as well as his other activities around rail trails and educating people through a variety of means, really focus. He's doing a lot of this as a volunteer, in addition to the fact that he is a professor of history at Shippensburg. So we appreciate all that you do to
Mhm.
make that connection between conservation and history for our readers and listeners.
See, now you're going to make me blush, huh?
Oh.
I'm grateful for that. The Lord knows, boosting my ego, Marcy. I will never say no to that. But I did want to just say that when our viewers get finished with this live stream, they should go and check out the PA Outdoors podcast, which is awesome and amazing in its own right. So,
Thank you.
I'm going to enjoy my coffee. I'm going to advertise the podcast as we go on. So, public lands. Public
Perfect.
lands. So, if we're thinking about public lands, and I wanted to, as you know me, I wanted to kind of put as broad a framework as I can on this, and as I always do, talk about the good and bad, right? The crunchy and the smooth with public lands. I wanted to start with, as we oftentimes do, with William Penn himself. And of course, when we look at the real kind of first public lands, as we might think of them kind of in the modern sense, is part of the original plan for Philadelphia, right? You'll notice that we have the Civic Square in the middle of Philadelphia itself. And then there are, the original design included these four areas, common lands, designed to be common pasture lands for the residents of Philadelphia, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, in each of the four corners of the city. And of course, this is part and parcel of of this vision of Penn for this green country town, right? This kind of this idyllic community founded, with his Quaker ideals. The trick, though, is, of course, and this is kind of where I'm getting into that crunchy and smooth framework. Public lands are tricky, aren't they? Right? Because they are lands that are set aside for the public good, but who determines what that public good is, right? And as time goes on, oftentimes, these public lands kind of shift in their focus, shift in what they are used for, and go in kind of an ebb and flow. In the case of Philadelphia, by the mid 1700s, and I talk about this in regard to Dock Creek, right, which becomes kind of comes the sewer. A lot of the public lands in these four squares became sort of junk. They were used for throwing out garbage. They were used, not in their kind of original intended purpose. And pointing at one of them, the northeast Northeast Commons, which later becomes Franklin Square. In 1961, Jane Jacobs, that kind of famous critic of post-war urbanism, pointed out in her "The Death and Life of Great American Cities" that Franklin Square, one of these original, had become the city's Skid Row Park. Right, a place for the homeless, a place that was kind of on the back end of a number of different municipal projects. And so as we're thinking about public lands, we have to think about their, kind of the evolution of what public lands mean, sort of the vision of how they are sort of laid out in what from the founders, but then as they ebb and flow and change over time. And of course, Franklin Square Park now is quite lovely, right? It gets reclaimed in the 1960s and 1970s. But that's kind of our starting point in thinking about what is the vision of public lands, what are their use, and oftentimes what is their misuse that then gets changed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good.
I can't help but think about, though, that these lands were indigenous lands prior to European settlement. Yep. So I think it's important to mention that.
Of course.
So this is really public lands through the lens of post-European settlement.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? It only becomes public when there is government control over those lands in the first place that then appropriates them and changes them for their new use. 100% true, right? And I'm happy you pointed that out, because let me give you another example. So by the time we get to the late 19th century, right, and we're going to talk about the development of forest lands, of public forests, right? But before we even get to that, this original notion of William Penn setting out public lands, that idea, even though it's not kind of fully realized oftentimes, continues to have this resonance among Pennsylvanians. And so in 1898, Gertrude Bosler Biddle, who was a close friend of one of your, I know, one of those people you admire most, and that's Myra Lloyd Dock. Gertrude Bosler Biddle was a kind of a socialite in Carlisle, in the town of Carlisle. She's one of the founders of the Carlisle Civic Club, kind of part of this big women's movement of the late 19th century, in which women get more involved in the civic square. And in sort of calling her community to action, she bemoans that the broad thoroughfares and the open squares she talks about in Carlisle that William Penn had bestowed upon our forefathers gave evidence of much civic carelessness. And she calls the Civic Club to order with 32 other women, and they sort of get to work on cleaning up city streets, right? On building parks and playgrounds, right? On beautification. The Shade Tree Commission gets started about that time in Carlisle, right? So even as we see the downsides of sort of the creation of public lands, as you talk about, they do also represent a call to action. Now, in Carlisle, it's really interesting. You're familiar, of course, and I'm going to come back and talk about this a little bit later. You're familiar, of course, with Project 70, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, this kind of great post-war move of funding for public parks. In fact, I'm sitting right across the street from my community park here in Shippensburg, which was paid for in part by public state funding through Project 70. Well, in Carlisle, in the early 1970s, there was this push for more public lands for public park, and kind of in a decision that proved to be quite infamous. The original African American cemetery in Carlisle, Lincoln Cemetery, was essentially declared as abandoned, right? The headstones were removed from that park, from that cemetery, and it was created into a public park space, right? And so just more recently, in the last few years, that sort of original use of that park space in Carlisle has kind of come back in a process of reconciliation in Carlisle, racial reconciliation in Carlisle. And so, again, we can see this notion, and you were very right to put this too. What does public land mean? Public for whom? Who gets to make the decisions of how that land is used? Who gets to determine what the best use is for that land? And then, of course, who is excluded from using that land in particular ways? And here we see in Carlisle, kind of at the very moment of, sort of appropriating land and using that land for a public good, other uses of it, in this case as a cemetery and a burial ground for, U.S. colored troops, among many others, is sort of erased and ignored and moved out of the picture.
I wasn't aware of that. That's, our office sits right across the street from a cemetery,
Mm-hmm.
and it's green space in an otherwise developed area, and people walk it.
Uh-huh.
So it's serving as both that green space and the cemetery.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you
Doesn't
can see
necessarily have to be one or the other. It
that's
it
true.
can
Well, and if you go in,
coexist.
but of course, absolutely true, right? So, okay, so I know, I'm already looking at halfway through my time, Marcy, so I got to talk. Okay,
Yes.
so
Go.
we're going to jump now to the Pennsylvania State Forest Districts, right? And this is, of course, a moment in time, and again, there's so much we can say about the creation of these big public lands, right? I mean, this is really when the state itself, the state agencies get involved in a kind of setting aside vast tracts of Pennsylvania as public lands, right? In 1897, the Forestry Reservation Commission is created, and funds are appropriated to that Forestry Commission for preserving lands, what they call unceded lands, right? Lands that don't have anything built on them, in the watersheds for the Delaware River, the Susquehanna, the Ohio River. And there's a whole set of stories, I think, that are really interesting about why these particular lands and how in particular they are used. But I want to point to just one element of this, and that is kind of comparing public lands in Pennsylvania to the kind of closest contemporary, and that is public lands in New York State. Because, of course, New York State at exactly the same time was creating its public lands in the Adirondacks and in the Catskills. But in both in Pennsylvania and in New York State, those lands were designed for improving water quality in the headwaters of major rivers. They were there for decreasing sedimentation, kind of all of those kind of environmental purposes. But in New York State, there was a big push that those public lands would, quote, remain wilderness, right? This is Adirondack Wilderness Park, right? And so ultimately, you have a little bit of a different framework in New York State. And there's reason for that. These are kind of the hunting preserves of the Rockefellers and the kind of the great wealth of New York City. Here in Pennsylvania, that's not what happened, and we know that, right? These were lands that, on the one hand, were set aside as a public good for public environmental reasons, but they were also kind of obviously and explicitly right from the very start designed for timber, to keep a vibrant timber industry active as well, just in a more planned way. That Pinchot's famous saying of the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. Now, what's interesting here, though, is that we again have this balance between public use for whom and how, because of course these were lands that had lots of local uses too. Local people were grazing their cattle on these lands. Local people were used to being able to go and collect firewood, right, to collect timber for things. And so suddenly these uses that were kind of local public uses now become sort of timber theft, or they become poaching, right? They become illegal. And in 1906, the Forestry Reserve Commission publishes Rule 17, which puts all of local cattle grazing requiring permits because the state agents felt that it had been being abused. And so this land now becomes sort of off limits for certain kinds of what locals would have considered public uses. I'll give you an example. So I pointed down here to our, my favorite, I'm partial, to the Michaud State Forest, right? And you know what, besides next to the railroads, right, where sparks from railroad engines would cause forest fires, you know what the number 2 reason was for forest fires in the Michaud State Forest in the early 19th century?
I don't.
Human cause, it is. Fires deliberately set by locals to burn the ground to improve next year's berry harvest. Huh? And that, of course, is a practice that had been taking place since the native peoples lived there. I mean, indigenous people burn the ground for the same reason, right? For ash, to take care of old growth, to get rid of insects. And now suddenly, of course, we know that forest fires are a bad thing, and there's this push towards zero forest fires. And now this kind of local practice becomes arson, right? And so we again have this balance, this question of what are public lands for, who's using them, and how, that sort of carries with us. Isn't that interesting?
That is very interesting. That is very, but we are, I think I would say too, some of our tech knowledge, or not our technology, but our knowledge base.
Yes.
Because we realize now that wildfire has a role when it's prescribed and controlled, unlike what we recently experienced in the Michaud, which was also human induced, which was an uncontrolled wildfire.
Yeah. Yes. Scary. Very scary. I think you and I have talked before. That fire, the Thompson Hollow fire, was less than a mile away from my farm. So that was way too close to comfort to me. Right. Okay.
Yes.
So moving on now. You would think that probably the next public land I would talk about is going to be state parks, because I know how much you love state parks. But I'm going to shift. I'm going to throw a little bit of a wild card in here. And instead about talking about state parks, I'm going to talk about our friends over in the Game Commission and wildlife management units. Now, I say that, but for folks who are really interested in kind of the tension between public land and private land in our state forests, I'm going to put a link here into the chat for everyone of a project that the Conservation Heritage Project has been partnering on, the Untold Stories Project, that talks about the historic Brown Farm, which became part of Laurel Hill State Park. So I'm sticking that into the chat right now for folks to look at. But I'm going to talk a little bit about wildlife management units. Now, Project 70, of course, this kind of great big bond issue in the mid-1960s that Maurice Goddard crisscrossed the state in order to get it passed, yeah? We think of it, of course, as providing enormous amounts of funding for state parks. You know, many of our most important state parks come out of Project 70, but it also provided funding for all sorts of other things too, including, again, this my local park right across the street. But it also enabled the Game Commission. They got $5 million from this to buy important wildlife areas threatened by human development. And probably certainly the biggest and one of the most important of these is the Middle Creek Marsh, Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area, right on the border there, between York and Lancaster counties, or is it, it's York and Lancaster. It's right on between York, Lancaster, and Lebanon. I can't remember exactly where it is. Don't hold it against me. Okay, so Middle Creek Marsh is, I think, this fascinating public land, paid for by the taxpayers of the state of Pennsylvania. But, and here's the tricky part, as we move forward in the 20th century, kind of untouched or undeveloped land becomes less and less as time goes on. And of course, just like with state parks, many of the wildlife management units, some of the most important ecological areas, are areas that are close to human development, right? I mean, they just are. I mean, humans have kind of spread out all across the state. And so we get increasingly to a time when you're not just looking at kind of abandoned lands, right? Abandoned, tax sales. But you're increasingly seeing the state government having to use the power of eminent domain to be able to put together these public lands. And of course, when that happens, increasingly, you have pushback. You have questions about what is the best use of this land. We have a strong element of private property in Pennsylvania, as in the rest of the country. And so consequently, the Middle Creek becomes this kind of flashpoint for this debate over should eminent domain be used for the creation of wildlife areas. Now, over time, those debates simmered down, and I say simmered in particular because you see arsons throughout the state, but here in Middle Creek increasing as well, you see arsons, you see protests against the use of government funds to purchase these lands. And so I think it's important for us to keep in mind and remember that part of this process of determining what lands, what use of public lands is best for the public doesn't just happen. I mean, it takes, it takes a lot of public policy, and they're oftentimes controversial. And that's another legacy of, of the creation of these public lands.
That's very interesting. And how do you reconcile the decisions as it relates to use?
And that's tricky. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, like that there's no easy answer to that, is there? Right? There just isn't. And as time goes on, those questions about public use, about the tension between public and private land, right? And those tensions about sort of what's the balance between use of eminent domain and concerns about private property rights threatens to derail, right? It threatens to derail the acquisition of public lands entirely, right? And so what we see during kind of in the wake of that in the 1980s and 1990s is a bit of a shift to a different style, a different model for creating public lands, right? And that sort of outgrowth results in different kinds of public lands. And it even calls into question, what is the public and public lands? I'll give you an example. Farmland preservation or historic preservation, right? Oftentimes public funds are used to purchase farm easements, right? To ensure that farmland will stay in agricultural production, right? Or to ensure that historic properties that are really important to local communities are going to avoid destruction. But increasingly, as time goes on through the 1980s and 1990s, it's not direct government intervention in creating these important spaces, but public-private partnerships, right? And of course, you know me. If I'm going to start talking about public-private partnerships and public lands, I have to start. I have to talk about rails to trails, right? I can't help myself. And so what we see then is a shift from sort of government direct acquisition of lands to governments, the state government providing matching grants, grant programs, partnerships, so that local communities, local organizations, whether they're local government units or whether they're local nonprofits like rail trail conservancies or land conservancies, they determine for themselves, the communities determine for themselves what lands should be, brought into, into the public trust. And then the state provides funds for those properties, on a matching basis, right? Our community conservation partnership programs, for example, right? Now, the trick, of course, though, is that even then, there are concerns about using public funds for, for acquiring private properties for public use. We see this, for example, I pulled out just a single example over here in the Pittsburgh to Erie rail trail. There was a long-running lawsuit over the use of rail banking for maintaining private property for that would otherwise revert to landowners, but instead stays as part of this rail corridor system. That was eventually sort of decided by the state Supreme Court that said, yes, in fact, that's the whole point of rail banking legislation, is to ensure that this land stays in the public trust or the public domain for transportation reasons. But of course, that is, those are controversies that sort of remain to be worked out. That whole question, though, too, of what is public land? My rail trail here that I love in Shippensburg, it is funded in part by state funds, in part by county funds, but ultimately it is privately owned. It is owned by my own rail trail council. So we open it for the public, right? But it is not publicly owned in the sense that a state park or that a state forest is. And I think increasingly that question of how we can bring public lands down to local communities, DCNR's goal of a public land within a 10-minute walk of every Pennsylvanian, that's not going to be accomplished by government, whether it's state or county or local, even kind of purchasing those lands outright. It's going to be a continuation of these public-private partnerships. And that brings kind of a whole new scenario to the notion of public lands that, again, has its trade-offs. It has its strengths and weaknesses that we are kind of currently exploring and living with today. So there you go. From William Penn.
And again, I don't necessarily think it's an either or, which is kind of sound like you were saying. It really, it's a combination of factors. It's a combination of state, county, community-owned public lands. It's
yes.
Public-private partnerships. It's could be museums with grounds, libraries with grounds. So that really is that combination. And I think that when we're talking about public lands, it's particularly on the national scale. There's so much pressure on that we're seeing that could potentially undermine our nationally owned lands. That it's important to recognize that there are a lot of benefits of public ownership.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
What do you see as some of those benefits, Alan?
Of public ownership? Well, it's for one, it's long lasting, right? That is to say that that when you have public ownership of property, it's long lasting. It's in perpetuity. It's forever, right? To the seventh generation. And that I think is, I think that is very reassuring to know that, certain types of important lands are going to remain in the public domain forever, right? I also think having that public ownership, it's important in the sense that it means that a community is invested, right? That it's invested, whether that's a local community, whether it's a state community, whether it's a national community, that it's invested in a particular vision, a community vision of how land can best be used. Now, of course, that vision can change and adapt over time, as our state forests have, right? I mean, as science and our understanding of science and the needs that are that we have as a state community have evolved over time, so too has our understanding on what the best use of particular aspects of the state forests have, right? And so my sense is that, as you say, having different kinds of public lands serving different kinds of interests, but all connected together in the sense of making sure that these are lands that are available and open for all Pennsylvanians, right? That to me is kind of the beauty of this of this system that's emerged over the last 150 years or so.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that sometimes there are some very challenging choices or decisions that need to be made, or conversations that need to be had. So I appreciate you illuminating that. So what do you have here? What is the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project?
Well, for folks, I would think that most folks are probably that are listening are probably knowledgeable about the Conservation Heritage Project. But if you're not, check us out, PA.conservationheritage.org. We have lots of resources spanning the whole scope of Pennsylvania's conservation, environmental justice history. We have a number of ongoing projects that we're working on right now. An oral history project. I know that you and your staff have been working on some trail-related projects, celebrating some key anniversaries that have been going on. And of course, we have access to all of the resources that we have been working on really it's been 15 years now. The Conservation Heritage Project's been in existence. A number of folks I've talked about today, Joseph Rothrock, Maurice Goddard, Myra Lloyd-Dock, all have documentaries that you can access through the Conservation Heritage Project page. And of course, we are always looking for new ideas on what areas we should be exploring now. This focus, for example, on looking at the untold stories of public lands that that have come at certain sacrifice, certain cost. at times to local communities for what ultimately is the public good. We've really been focusing on those in recent years, and we're always looking to add to that collection. So if folks are interested in coming on board and being part of the project, boy, we're always happy to have them.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point as well, is that sometimes these conversations aren't necessarily comfortable conversations.
Oh my heavens!
Because we have to look at some of our mistakes and some of the people that were disenfranchised. So they're important conversations to have.
That's right. And for us, ultimately, the goal of the conservation project, as much as we're looking at the past, our goal really is to look to the future, right? To figure out how we can think about the mistakes and the victories of the past in order to help shape better public policy going forward. Because ultimately, we want to make sure that we are leaving this legacy of public lands, of public parks, of clean air and clean water that we have inherited, that really makes Pennsylvania the great state that it is. We want to make sure that we are doing justice by our descendants as well, just as our ancestors did for us.
Yes, great. Well, thank you, Alan. I appreciate you
My
being
pleasure.
here. And I don't remember what we're digging into next month, but we will be back on the third Wednesday of June, which is the 16th of June at lunch. So feel free to join us right on Facebook.
And in the meantime,
YouTube.
of course, check out Think Outside, the podcast from PA Parks and Forest Foundation.
Yes. Thank you, Alan. All right. Thank you, everybody.